Hey Wargamers, I'm Mike from Epic Duck Studios, and welcome to the Epic Hobby. Today I'm going to be finishing up Tentacles, the Season 2 mascot for the Fisherman's Guild. I'm just going to go ahead and get some colors ready on my wet palette. These are the same colors I used to paint the Tentacles in the first video. Specifically, I'm using Electric Blue, Magic Blue, Dark Blue, Hexed Lichen, and Warlord Purple. Between videos, I painted the rocks that he's sitting on with just a plain dark gray base coat, and right now what I'm doing is just fixing a few areas where either the bottoms of the tentacles were unpainted or where I got a little bit of the gray on them. So I'm just using the 4 primary colors that I used to paint the tentacles to just kind of spot in a few little fixes. Because these are on the underside of the tentacles, I'm not really worrying too much about wet blending, but I'm taking a little bit of time to blend them when I can. Now I'm going to begin painting all the suction cups on the bottom of his tentacles with the electric blue. I want these to really stand out, so I'm with the electric blue because it's a very bright, almost neon kind of blue, especially when it contrasts against the purple. This is a pretty painstaking process because he has a lot of these. What I'm doing first is painting the side of each suction cup, basically the little outward facing edge. Then I'm going to go ahead and paint the round surface as well. This is going to make sure that every visible aspect of each suction cup is painted. Now each suction cup has a little more shape than that because there's a back surface as well, but it's facing away from the viewer no matter how you look at the model, with the exception of a couple tentacles that are on vertical surfaces, so for the most part I can completely ignore them and just focus on the parts you can see. Now these suction cups are completely visible because they're on a vertical surface, so I want to make sure I get all the way around them. But on the flip side, they're also against the brightest tentacle because this one happened to be the longest. So there's not that stark contrast that there is on the other tentacles with these suction cups. So it's not quite as important that they are fully painted either, because half of this tentacle is electric blue in the first place. Alright, I think you've watched me paint enough suction cups by now. Let's move on to something else. Next up, I'm going to begin base coating all the different ropes on Tentacles using Vallejo Game Color Earth. Okay, first of all, it's really confusing that a character with tentacles is named Tentacles. I am really sorry if it's a little bit ambiguous when I'm talking about him versus aspects of the model. I'm getting some Vallejo Game Color Khaki here ready as well, which will be used as a highlight color. So you can see there's a couple ropes kind of flung over the top of Tentacles, just kind of holding this net in place over the back of his head. And then of course there's the net itself. So I'm just going to work my way around the model, base coating all these different straps and netting with the Vallejo Game Color Earth first. Now, because these straps are a raised surface, it's important to look at them from different angles and make sure that you get basically like the front, the back, and the top, because they are a 3D object, it's not just a line painted across the surface, but it does have some raised edges, and you don't want them to look like it's got flesh kind of stuck to the side. So it's important to just look at the model from different angles and just double check that it looks like it's been fully painted. Alright, I think you get the gist of painting these straps now, so I'm going to go ahead to the netting. So painting the netting is a lot like painting the leather straps, or the ropes, whatever you want to call them, where you really just have to look at it from different angles. And since it's a grid, there's 4 very specific angles you need to look at this from. So right now I'm painting them from the top down, and if I were to turn the model over and look at it from the bottom up, you'd see it looks actually quite unpainted by comparison. So I'm working on the horizontal parts of the net first, just painting the top side of that. Now I've turned the model 90 degrees, and I'm working on the sort of left-facing side of each of the verticals. The goal here is to be precise enough that the red flesh shows through the net, which really helps give the appearance that it is in fact a net and not just a big, brown blob stuck on the back of the miniature. And now I've turned the model again, just flipped it over, and I'm working on the right-facing sides of the verticals. So there's still the sort of underside of each of the horizontal parts left to go. Okay, let's jump ahead to highlighting the net. I think you kind of get the point now. I'm going to be using Vallejo Game Color Khaki, so that's 1 shade lighter than the Vallejo Game Color Earth. And what I'm going to be doing is just a general highlight on the straps, especially where they cross over the top of the head, because it's sort of the brightest areas. But to begin with, I'm focusing on the knots and like the most raised areas, because I want to really draw attention to those. So there's different parts here where you can see that the ropes and the net are tied onto some metal hoops. Now I haven't painted the hoops yet, so they may not be really visible on camera, but there are a couple just sort of situated around his head, and I'm sort of starting there, making sure the knots are really visible, and then just doing a general highlight on the leather straps as they sort of cross over the top of his head and the sides of his head. Now I could go really crazy and start giving this some actual texture. Right now I'm doing this basically as just a sort of plain flat line that's just brighter at the top than it is at the sides. There's really no subsurface detail here. I'm not making it look like it's rope or worn leather or anything like that. So I could take this a lot further if I wanted to, but this is also a gaming piece, and I sort of paint my gaming pieces to a little bit lower standard than I like to paint my display pieces, so that if they take any damage in the course of a game, it's easier to fix. Now I'm going to begin working on the net, and the process here is pretty much the same as it was on the straps, except that what I'm doing is I'm only really looking at how the net looks from the top down, because that's where a natural highlight would land, would be on the vertical surfaces. So really, just looking at the miniature from the top down here, I'm using the edge of my brush to just grab all the knots where the different parts of the net meet together, and a little bit of it is painting the rope between each knot. This technique is actually fairly similar to dry brushing, except that I'm not being really rough, I'm being very controlled with where my paint goes, because I don't want it to accidentally get into the spaces between the net. I don't want to accidentally paint any of his skin. So what I'm doing there is just taking advantage of the fact this is a 3D object and not a flat canvas, so there are going to be details that will simply interact with the brush more than others. Alright, let's move this along. So next I'm going to add some extreme highlights to the net and straps using Vallejo Game Color Bone White. So this is just 1 shade brighter again than the khaki. It's just a little bit off-white, it's got a little bit of a cream tint to it, so I could highlight just a little bit further if I wanted to. It's really not necessary in this case, but this will push it close enough to a bright color. And you can see I'm placing it quite deliberately just on like the biggest knots, sort of the areas with the most detail. And I'm really going to focus on just the knots. I'm not really hitting any of the rope between the knots on the back of the net. just so the knots themselves stand out a little bit more than the surrounding detail. Now I'm going to highlight each of the straps, basically at their highest point, so right as they cross over the top of the head, and also just a little bit on the sides as they taper up towards the top. So, Tentacles the octopus has a couple metal facial piercings, different hooks that have got stuck in them and so on, as well as the different O-rings that are holding the straps and the net together. So I'm just going to go ahead and base coat those with a dark gray. I honestly can't tell you what color this was. It was already on my wet palette, and I unfortunately didn't document it. But it's just a dark gray. I probably actually just literally mixed white and black on my palette to get it. This is just going to be the base coat color for all these different metal areas, and because they're all small hoops, I'm going to paint them in a non-metallic metal fashion by just adding some really quick, easy highlights to the top edge of each ring. Next, I'm going to highlight each of those metal areas with a little bit of Vallejo Game Color Cold Gray. This is just going to be a simple top-down highlight on each of the metal details. Next up, I'm using P3 Moro White to add some final highlights to the metal rings. I'm going to mix just a touch of the cold gray in with the white, just so that it's not too stark, and that gives me the option to go to a pure white highlight if I really feel I need to, but this is still going to be much brighter than the surrounding grays and should get me there. You can see that this bright highlight is barely more than just a single point on each ring. Now that I've got the Moro White on my palette, I'm going to mix some with Electric Blue. This will give me a brighter color to highlight some of the suction cups with that were specifically on that front tentacle, where it was already against an electric blue base coat and they really didn't stand out much. There we go, those suction cups are way more visible now than they were before. Okay, so I really like this lighter blue, so I'm going to go ahead and use it as a bit of an edge highlight, just a small point on each of the other suction cups as well. So I personally feel I saved the best for last here. I'm going to be painting his eyes with a couple different colors, Vallejo Game Colors Sick Green, and some fluorescent green from War Colors. Tentacles has really large expressive eyes, especially his left eye, because he is kind of squinting his right eye, and it lets you do some things with painting them that you just can't do on smaller eyeballs. So, now octopuses also have a large sort of horizontal iris, kind of like a sideways cat eye almost. And so what I'm doing here is I'm leaving a horizontal band unpainted, just letting that really dark blue show through that I base coated the eye with, and just painting dark green above and below it. I'm going to do the same on both eyes. Now it's much easier here on his left eye because it's basically much bigger and much more open than his right eye. So I'm using the Sick Green just to build up a foundation, and then I'm really going to brighten it up a lot using both the War Colors Fluorescent Green, which is an actual day glow pigment. If I put it under a black light, it would actually light up. So I'm going to be using a little bit of the Fluorescent Green, and then going just a little bit further than that with some white as well. Now, as mentioned, his right eye is a little bit trickier to paint because it's quite squinted compared to the left eye. I'm doing my best here, but I do make a couple little mistakes where I get a little bit of paint on the eyelids or completely fill in the area where the pupil should be. So I'm just coming back in with a little bit of the dark blue now to repaint the pupil. Alright, that's a crisis averted. So now I'm switching to the War Colors Fluorescent Green, and I'm making sure I get very little of this on the brush. It's a very bright pigment, and it's also a little bit of a translucent color, and I don't want it to just kind of get everywhere. I want to make sure that it's very intentionally placed. I'm making sure it's brightest beside the pupil to really make the pupil just kind of stand out, and also to really accent the fact that it's a very spherical eyeball. You can see just how quickly that fluorescent green is brightening up the Sick Green base coat. Here I'm just doubling it up closest to the pupil, making sure it's nice and bright. Almost gives the impression that the pupil is kind of set back into the eye a little bit. It's not, but when you do look at an octopus eye, you do see that sort of detail to it. And I wanted to emulate that in my painting. Now I'm going to brighten up his eyelids and eyebrows, just using a little bit of Vallejo Gold Yellow. Basically, I just want the skin around his eyeballs to be a little bit brighter than any other areas of the face, so that it kind of really draws you into looking at them. You can see that I'm putting the gold yellow on very thinly. I'm almost just using it to tint the really light highlights that are already there. Next to my palette, I'm going to mix a little bit of Moro White with the gold yellow just to get a brighter shade. There, I'm pretty happy with those eyelids now. They definitely stand out more than the surrounding flesh and really draw you into looking at them. So I'm going to mix a little bit of Moro White in now with the War Colors Fluorescent Green, just to get a very light version of that, and just use it to outline the pupils. Lastly, I'm going to add one bright spot to his eye with a pure dot Amoro white. Now, unfortunately, the dot on his right eye ended up covering the pupil just a little bit, so I'm going to go back in with the pupil color and just fix that now. Alright, and with that, Tentacles is complete. This guy needs a little bit of basing, but otherwise, he's fully painted and ready to hit the table. I absolutely love how many colors I got to bring into this model, especially colors I don't really get to use together. I feel like I used almost half my Vallejo paint case on this model, and I love any time I get an excuse to use Warcolor's Fluorescent Green. It's just a fantastic color. Thanks again for watching, and as always, do something epic.